Good afternoon, class. Ryan and I here are going to be filling out a Sweet 16 bracket for all the president's foreign policy from McKinley onward.
Round one is McKinley versus Roosevelt. McKinley led the U.S. to a decisive victory in the Spanish-American War and gained control of Guam, Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines.
Despite his victory in the Spanish-American War and his acquiring of the Philippines, during the Filipino War and Revolt, McKinley had concentration camps in the Philippines in a similar way that Spain had in Cuba. However, on the other hand, TR issued a corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, which enabled the United States to have control over stabilizing Latin American countries, which is why in round one, McKinley versus TR moves on. Round one, Wilson versus Harding, Coolidge, and Hoover.
Wilson's ideals for the 14 points and League of Nations eventually led to Roosevelt's UN and NATO.
And although Hoover's Stimson Doctrine refused to recognize Japan for invading Manchuria, his tariff policy stimulated international trade wars, hurting the Great Depression.
Which is why Wilson wins.
Round one, FDR versus Truman.
Truman's overseeing of the Berlin airlift terrorized the U.S. and villainized the Soviet Union.
And although FDR was successful in the Destroyer Base Agreement and the Lend-Lease Act, his deportation of 100,000 Japanese to internment camps is too much to ignore.
Which is why Truman wins. Round one, Ike versus Kennedy.
Ike stimulated nuclear weapon growth to give the United States an edge over the Soviet Union.
However, Kennedy initiated the creation of security ties with Israel, but this was overshadowed by him signing off on the failed Bay of Pigs invasion of Cuba.
Which is why Ike's going to take this one. Round one, LBJ versus Nixon Ford. Although LBJ signed the Immigration Act in 1965, which liberalized the United States' policies towards non-European immigrants, he drastically escalated the United States' involvement in Vietnam by sending over 16,000 advisors and 550,000 troops after the Tonkin Gulf Resolution.
This problem was solved by Nixon with his policies of Vietnamization, which pulled out many of the U.S. troops in Vietnam. Which is why Nixon wins. Round one, Carter versus Reagan. Carter promoted human rights in the Camp David Accord, but his failure presiding over the Iran hostage crisis resulted in the deaths of 8 U.S. servicemen.
Reagan, on the other hand, was able to negotiate with the Soviet Union General Secretary Mikhail Gorbachev to lower armaments on a worldwide scale, which is why Reagan's going to advance.
Round one, Bush Sr. versus Clinton. Bush Sr. orchestrated a successful and efficient invasion of Kuwait to drive out Saddam Hussein's forces.
And while Clinton played an instrumental role in the Northern Ireland Good Friday Agreement, his signing off on the bombing of the leading pharmaceutical plant in Sudan resulted in the death of tens of thousands of people. And for that reason, we're going to have Bush Sr. moving on. Round one, Bush Jr. versus Obama. Although Obama's involvement in Operation Neptune Spear led to the death of Osama bin Laden, he pulled the troops out of the Middle East too early, which led to the chaos, anarchy, and the influence of ISIS in the Middle East that we see today.
Bush, on the other hand, succeeded in the United States-India Civil Nuclear Agreement, which improved relations between the two countries.
And for these reasons, Bush Jr. advances. Round two, TR versus Wilson.
Roosevelt successfully negotiated an end to the Russo-Japanese War, for which he won a Nobel Prize.
And although Wilson successfully led the United States to a victory in World War I, he was unable to properly clean up Europe afterwards, which led to World War II. And for these reasons, TR is going to be advancing.
Round two, Ike versus Truman.
Eisenhower deposed the Iranian leader during the 1953 Iranian coup d'etat and used nuclear threats to put the Korean War with China to a stalemate.
And although his issuing of the Truman Doctrine helped contain communism, his unconstitutional actions with regards to the Korean War left a mess for Eisenhower to clean up.
And for these reasons, Ike moves on. Round 2. Nixon, Ford versus Reagan.
Nixon used so-called ping-pong diplomacy to initiate the normalization of relations with the People's Republic of China.
And although Reagan negotiated the INF Treaty, which reduced nuclear arms between the Soviet Union and the United States and eventually led to the treaty known as START I, he presided over the Iran-Contra scandal, which was unconstitutional by selling arms to Iran and using that money to support a right-wing rebel group against the Sandinistas in Nicaragua. And for these reasons, we're going to have Nixon moving on. Round 2. Bush Jr. versus Bush Sr.
Despite the fact that Bush Jr. established the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS, a program which helped combat the virus greatly in Africa, he committed too much government spending to the war in the Middle East.
Bush Sr., on the other hand, invaded Panama in 1989 to overthrow the warlord and drug trafficker Manuel Noriega. And it is for these reasons that we will have Bush Sr. advancing.
Round 3. Teddy Roosevelt versus Eisenhower.
Ike was the first to articulate the domino theory on communist expansion in 1954.
And despite TR's negotiations to gain U.S. control of the construction of the Panama Canal, he left the recently acquired Philippines unchecked for Taft to deal with.
And that is why Ike moves on. Round 3. Nixon Ford versus Bush Sr.
Nixon started a taunt with the Soviet Union following his diplomacy with China, leading to SALT I and the Ballistic Missile Treaty.
And although Bush Sr. signed START I with Gorbachev, declaring peace between the United States and Russia after the USSR dissolution in 1991, some would argue that he did not go far enough in Desert Storm to destroy the regime of Saddam Hussein and would eventually lead to the Second Iraq War.
And it's for these reasons that Nixon moves on. Championship round, Nixon Ford versus Eisenhower. While Nixon's support of Israel in the Yom Kippur War led to an Israeli victory, some would argue that both Nixon and Ford underestimated the Soviet threat by adhering too closely to the détente foreign policy. On the other hand, Ike forced Israel, the United Kingdom, and France to end their invasion of Egypt during the Suez Canal crisis in 1956, which is why Eisenhower wins it all.
You filming?
Who wins?
Eisenhower!
Who wins?
Eisenhower!
Eisenhower wins!
Yay!
Yay! Who wins, Grace?
Eisenhower wins! Eisenhower wins!
Hey, Bridget!
Eisenhower wins! Eisenhower wins!
Come on, enthusiasm! Miss Wolf!